Stephen Rustow, the next speaker, is principal of Museoplan, which he founded in 2006. He's also currently professor of architecture at Cooper Union. He was previously a lecturer and studio critic at Columbia University's Paris studio and has served as an invited juror in design studios and as a lecturer at Columbia, Cornell, Princeton, and 3 of the Paris University campuses. He has a BA in anthropology from the University of Rochester, a master's in architecture, and another in urban planning from MIT. He has worked for 3 decades as an architect and planner. Before founding Museoplan, he was senior associate principal with Cohen Peterson Fox and directed that firm's work on the renovation and expansion of the Museum of Modern Art in New York with Taniguchi Associates. Among his responsibilities for that project was detailing of the museum's galleries, the renovation of its original building and sculpture garden, and the reprogramming and design of the education wing. And he led the construction supervision team for the entire project over its 7-year duration. Before that, he was an associate partner in charge of design with Pei Cobb Fried and Partners, where he was a senior designer on several of the firm's museum projects, most notably the additions to the Louvre. He was the director of the Paris office of the firm in 1990 and was put in charge of the second phase of the expansion of the Louvre, the Richelieu wing, for which he designed the galleries of Oriental antiquities, Islamic art, and the French and Northern schools of painting. So if you don't like any of those, you can talk to Stephen during the lunch break. He also designed the Tuileries Terrace and was the supervising designer of the Carousel Gardens, including the installation of the state collection of Mayol bronzes. And upon his return to New York, he led design efforts on 3 other museum projects for Pei Cobb Fried. Currently, he does a lot of museum work. There's a 3-story, 3,000 square meter art space close to the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. He worked on the Culture Shed downtown for Diller and Scofidio. He is working on the Museum of Urbanism and Urban Constellation in Hangzhou in China, and was awarded the project for, designing and restoring the National Museum of Bulgaria. And he's written a great deal on the topics of design in museums, including lighting and exhibition galleries, and the role of museums in the urban fabric. So it's a pleasure to present Stephen Rustow.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Dean Miller, for that introduction. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my partner here today. We're a small consulting firm, and all of the projects that were just mentioned were projects that the 2 of us did together, and it's been a great pleasure to be involved in all of them. You said right to advance. So I entitled this in keeping with the theme, Conserving the Container of the Museum as Museological Object, but I could just as easily have called it Curating the Container of the Museum as Museological Subject. And what I'd like to do is to talk about 2 of the projects that Dean Miller just mentioned, the Louvre and MoMA, in terms of what I see as that kind of ambiguity. I think it's clear that I'm not a conservator. I don't deal directly with the issues that are involved in these objects, but the premise of what follows is easily summed up. If the fundamental mission of any collecting museum is acquisition, conservation, and display, then in all but a very few cases, a moment arrives when the institution confronts the inadequacies of the space that's available for an ever-expanding mass of objects. The choices are limited. One may try to show more by changing installations more frequently or pushing more and more objects into progressively more crowded spaces. But inevitably, a second moment arrives when creating more space, new space, better space, at least we hope it's better space, eventually is seen as the only long-term viable solution. And at that juncture, the choices are also limited. One can remake the space one has, squeezing more galleries out of space that was originally intended for some other use, and often, as all of you know, that's the conservation lab, which is given its own space somewhere else so that what used to be conservation can be made into galleries. But eventually there's this idea that one has to make new space, either on or under, next to, or on top of the site that one has. And it's then that an interesting question emerges for any institution that focuses on conservation and display. what is the status of the original museum building? And what is the obligation of the museum to preserve some aspect of its previous physical incarnation? Or to put it another way, what responsibility do museums have to sustain an understanding of their own material evolution over time? This responsibility, if that's what it should be called, is an extension of the work that museums do. Museums do not simply amass discrete objects, they curate collections, which have their own logic and history. Any object that enters the collection takes on an augmented meaning simply by virtue of being part of it, just as the collection's meaning is subtly changed by the addition of each acquired object. And so I think one may ask whether a museum that undertakes an expansion or a renovation does not, in some analogous sense, augment the meaning of the new architecture with whatever part of the original building is kept, just as the new addition will necessarily change physical relationships that touch on use, identity, and meaning. The interesting question then is how museums choose to curate their own conservation and the rationale for the choices they make, what they keep, what they show, what they conceal, and what kind of narrative those conservation choices serve. So to repeat, I'm not a conservator. What I'm going to be describing are projects in which I participated, I suppose it could be called a participant observer role, both at the Louvre and at MoMA. The projects are quite different, but I hope that you'll agree that they share some similarities in terms of the way in which they confront these choices that deal with the ambiguity between conservation and curation. So the Louvre is now in its 9th century as a built complex. It's in its 3rd century as a museum, but 90% of the building that we actually see when we go to Paris is only 150 years old. This recaps in a very summary fashion, not actually the 9 centuries of the Louvre, but the 9 principal stages of its evolution up until the present, which is the last image on the bottom here. It's interesting to notice that in the first part of the 19th century, the Louvre, which was gradually expanded and was intended to be completed, still included a large part of the first arrondissement of Paris. I'm sure many of you know the history of the Louvre, but it starts as a fortification in the 12th century and then is quickly expanded. Every time the Louvre succeeds in some sense in protecting Paris from the west, Paris hops over the walls established by the Louvre and begins to expand to the west, which then reinitiates the process. The construction of the Tuileries, which is the third over on the top, sets in motion the great set of additional construction, which will eventually lead to the famous désaxement, the fact that the Louvre and all of the western axis of Paris are slightly shifted in terms of their geometric relationship to each other. And it's Henry IV in the beginning of the 17th century that determines that the Louvre should be subject to what's called the Grand Dessin. In other words, the idea that the Louvre needs to be completed by building along the Seine, turning north, and then bringing it back to itself. That project, as again I'm sure many of you know, is only actually achieved during the Second Empire by Louis Napoleon, and it then, in fact, it's achieved in 1867, which is just in time for the Great World's Exposition, which is held in Paris, and this is seen as a critical moment in Paris's presentation of itself to all of Europe and to indeed the world. Of course, this is right in the midst of Haussmann's complete restructuring of Paris, of which the Louvre is seen to be one of the most important anchors. And again, just, sorry to take a step back, to make the point, virtually all of the construction that you see on the interior courts of the Louvre and at the time the Tuileries is 19th century construction. Of course, this achèvement or apotheosis of the Louvre only lasts 3 years. At the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the Commune of Paris in 1871 sets fire to the Tuileries. The ruins, it's interesting to note, lasted for another 12 years while the Assemblée Nationale debated what should be done with them. There were many proposals, including one by the original architect of the courtyards, that they be restored. Ultimately, it was seen for symbolic reasons as inappropriate to restore the Tuileries, and they were demolished. which gives us the configuration of the palace very much as you see it today. So we're obviously at the east end and looking west, and here you see the shift in axis, which goes all the way up to the Champs-Élysées and past the Arc de Triomphe and all the way to La Défense. So when the firm of IMP and Partners was asked in 1982 to begin the process of planning and designing the expansion of the Louvre, and as you all know, it involved the pyramid in the center, a new entry, and a full 500,000 square feet of new non-exhibition space, back-of-house space. The Louvre famously had very little back-of-house. 90% of the palace was open to the public when we started the project. One new condition, and a very interesting condition, was put into the equation, and that was that the Louvre had the intention to create what it actually called an new exhibition circuit, not quite a full department, but that it was going to create something called l'histoire du Louvre, which was seen as a way of using the building to explain its own history. And this was very deliberately intended to be an opening to visitors from around the world, but especially French visitors, to use the Louvre to address three major themes. The first was the position of the building as a critical element and the site of French political and monarchic history. The second was, as I've already alluded, the building as architecture and its place in the development of the city of Paris. And the third was the Louvre as arguably the first public museum in the world, and the history of the Louvre as a collecting institution and its role in creating the national collections of France. So the idea was that those three themes could best be addressed by creating, in some sense, a circuit for the visitors through the building itself, where, with obviously a great deal of explanatory information, the building and the spaces within it would be the major elements that would create this story. So there are two challenges for that kind of approach. The first, obviously, is that most things are where they are. It's very difficult to pick up pieces of buildings and move them around, and in fact, from a conservation point of view, it's not a good idea. But what that means is to create a coherent narrative, there's the challenge of taking things that are quite remote from each other and actually trying to establish some sort of continuity or some sort of connection, or at least a global understanding of how they relate to each other. So just to take two random examples, this is the oldest part, the foundations of the Tour Philippe Auguste from 1190, which are under the Cour Carrée. And this is the city wall of Charles V, which are separated by a full kilometer. You can see the Tour Philippe Auguste, which is to the right of the screen, and then the Mur Charles V and its ditch or fosse, which is on the left side of the screen. It's not simply that they're physically far apart. It's that anybody who had an interest in understanding the development between the end of the 12th century and the middle of the 14th finds him or herself obligated to go through the 19th, the 18th, the 17th, and parts of the 16th century, or to walk through the pyramid and essentially be immersed in 20th century design. So there is this immediate kind of collage aspect to this idea of creating a coherent narrative which begins to examine pieces of the building itself. The other conceptual problem for this approach, and it was one that we engaged in a lot of discussion of, but were not ultimately responsible for, is that obviously the objects of conservation or preservation are of very different types. There are rooms, spaces, and decors in the Louvre that are still used for exactly the purposes for which they were first designed and built. There are other rooms that still have their original decor but are used for completely different purposes. There are fragments of architectural spaces which either were demolished or were incorporated into new configurations. And then there are fragments which essentially are lodged in new spaces and configurations that have nothing to do with what they were originally intended for. And each of those four categories presents a challenge in terms of the conservation issues, but I also think a great challenge in terms of the issues of curating a coherent narrative. So all of these issues were thrown into very sharp relief by the second phase of the Louvre, which was its completion, I put that in quotes, with the conversion of the Richelieu wing to museum use. Now, the Richelieu wing, which is this wing that was built in 1857 under Louis Napoleon, was in fact built as an office building. It had 6 to 8 stories of empire bureaucracy management in what was, even at the time, criticized as a rabbit warren of interconnected rooms and courtyards and reception salons. It was roundly criticized already by the beginning of the 19th century, and by 1980 it was clear that no modern European nation could have a Ministry of Finance in such conditions. So one of the first decisions of President François Mitterrand was to build a new Ministry of Finance, a very striking modern building a little bit further east up the Seine, and in so doing to realize the dream that was first articulated actually by the Convention in 1794, that one day the entire Louvre Palace would become a museum. So the scale of the undertaking was to, in fact, resituate the history of the Louvre in this complex where, for the first time, the Louvre was now entirely given over to the display of art. This is the exterior of that building, the Richelieu wing, and the solution from an architectural point of view was completely schizophrenic, to say the least. The decision was made not by the architects, but by the Special Monument Commission of Historical Monuments, des Monuments Historiques, that the exterior of the building, as it had been completed in 1857, would be completely restored to its former glory, whereas the interior of the building, with a few very notable exceptions, would be entirely demolished, so that the 8 stories of office space would disappear and could be replaced by 3 stories of relatively palatial-sized rooms that corresponded, by the way, to the 3 palatial stories that are evident on the facade. In other words, that this space, never conceived for museum use, would be rebuilt as if it had been the palace, so that the sequence of rooms now thought to be appropriate for art could be continued in a completely new architecture, but all of this to be hidden, as it were, behind the 19th century restored facades. This shows you a cross-section and simply makes the point that there are, a number of new rooms. Pointer doesn't seem to be doing it, but both in the center, all of which now essentially take for their template the facades of the building, which was never the case when the building itself was built. All of this happening while the exterior, as I said a moment ago, is getting a very thorough restoration. Restoration is a complicated word, as many of you know much better than I. The irony with the exterior of the facade of the Richelieu wing was that much of the work involved trying to undo, to the extent possible, all of the well-intentioned preservation efforts of the 60s and 70s, when almost all of the major sculpture on the facade, and there's a great deal of sculpture on the facade, had been encased in plastic resins, which were thought to actually preserve the stone against the damage of the weather. And as I'm sure many of you know much better than I, what that actually does, as soon as there's the slightest flaw in that coating, is it allows water and all sorts of acidic elements to get under that skin, where they gradually eat away the stone from the inside. And so restoration actually involved wholesale new creation of 19th century sculptures. Here you can see on the sculpture of Vauban, the kind of erosion that had happened because of these treatments in the 70s. And this is, in fact, a copy one can argue about how faithful a copy it is, but it's certainly a plausible copy of this sculpture, and it sits where Vauban always did, on the facade. And yet it really goes to the question of what the authenticity of this facade is intended to be. I didn't bring them, but there are, and some of you may know them, extraordinary photographs that show the kind of X-ray topographical analysis which showed what parts of the stone could be reused, how much of the stone might be safely re-engaged, whether one could actually, in some sense, patch some of the sculptures. And there are, I believe, 87 of these on the facade. And each of those had a different biography. I think about half of them were completely replaced and others to some extent reused. So that's what's going on just on the left side of the photograph, while simultaneously the interiors are being completely gutted. And when I say gutted, I mean entirely gutted, demolished down to the ground. You can see here the traces of the 6 stories of the offices with all of the entresol, and you can get some notion of the scale there with that small caterpillar kind of running around and pulling down walls. This was an enormously complicated engineering feat, because obviously these 19th century walls were not intended to be standing by themselves. And we actually had to create a set of braced trusses which built the new floor levels of the building from the top down. So you would demolish 2 levels, brace the level that you had just demolished with what would eventually support the new floor, then demolish 2 more levels, same story again. And so it was building from the top down in order, once again, to give the Louvre its new palatial dimension. And here you see it. The courtyards were lowered in order, I'm sure you know, to make a connection underneath the public passage, which was reopened to the Place du Palais Royal. And the effect was to create these grand spaces, which were now seen as of a piece with the rest of the palace, although they are quite emphatically a late 20th century interpretation of what a palatial room for, in this case, 17th century Dutch painting ought to look like, with the provision of a new lighting system. So whether you like these rooms or don't like them, as Peter suggested a moment ago, I think that there's only one word for what the whole effort actually represents, and that's pastiche. There is no authenticity here. There may be some felicitous moments in terms of display, and there may be a way of actually respecting history, but when you try to take those 2 pieces and put them together, in some sense, I think philosophically it's a problematic issue. There were even new period rooms that were designed. This was much criticized at the time, but it represents the first time since these paintings, the Rubens sequence on the life of Marie de Medici, had been assembled in the Louvre. It's the first time that a space was large enough to actually bring all those paintings back together. These were originally designed for the Palais de Luxembourg, and from the moment that they had been moved to the Louvre, there had never been a space in which they could all physically be displayed together. And when we confronted that, it was clear that simply hanging these on the wall made very little sense, because they were originally part of the architectural frames and woodwork of the long salon of which they were a part at the Luxembourg. So this was, without duplication, an effort to evoke the setting in which these paintings might originally have been seen, all of this in a space carved out of, once again, an 8-story 19th century office building. There were, nevertheless, some real period rooms that were still part of the Richelieu building. These are called the Appartement du Duc de Mornay, the nephew of Louis Napoleon. And these were lovingly restored, where every object was, every piece of furniture was very carefully documented, gilding regilded, velvet replaced, all of the more or less normal attention that's given to sustaining objects with the highest conservation standards. And the irony is that there are spaces, this is one of the major staircases, the staircase of the minister, which is obviously from the 19th century. There was even a suggestion that the new circulation systems, which address, after all, the same architectural scale as the 19th century ones, now stood in some parallel relationship to the architecture of the 19th century. So one could be forgiven for thinking that there was even a present historicizing about the significance of the architecture that was being made, or at least what its significance might be seen as being 30, 40, 100 years hence. I don't want to leave the Louvre without picking up on the wonderful story that was told about the Veronese, which sits just exactly opposite the spaces I've just shown you in the Salle des États. While we were working on the Richelieu wing, there was an extremely extravagant and expensive restoration of that painting, which was undertaken in anticipation of the second centennial of the Louvre. It was restored in place, which I think anticipates the idea of restoration or conservation as performance, which we'll be dealing with this afternoon. And there's a simple reason for that. It was brought over the Alps, rolled up around a cannon, and it was unrolled in the Salle des États and restretched and put on a wall, and it's too big to be taken out of the room without taking it down and rolling it up again. And all the conservation experts agree that taking it down and rolling it up again would be a disaster for the painting. In fact, with all due deference to Malraux's patriotic reasons for wanting to hold on to the ill-gotten goods, I think even the Italians agree that there is no safe way of taking the Nostra Cana out of the Salle des États and bringing it back to Venice, even if they wanted to. What's interesting about that story is that the restoration, which was by a French-Italian team, undertaken at great expense over about a year and a half, concluded with a very dramatic moment at which, as our first speaker said, it was observed that the painting had always been installed at a height that was much too low. It was meant to be seen from below, and the Salle des États was high enough so that you could actually lift the painting up. And so a whole new ossature, a kind of structure, was created behind the wall that would allow the painting to be hoisted to more or less exactly the position in which it was installed in the refectory, which would allow you to see it, at least at that angle, if you could ever see past the crowds that were trying to look at the Mona Lisa. That maneuver, after they had just finished the restoration at great expense, started, I believe, on a Friday afternoon and suddenly stopped when the painting tilted over and crashed through a piece of scaffolding and a ladder, which tore a 1.5 meter hole through this freshly restored Veronese. To his everlasting credit, the director of the Louvre, Michel Laclotte, called a news conference immediately and said, you need to know there's been an accident, and you need to know there's a hole, and you need to know we've looked at the hole and we can repair it, but nobody's going to see anything for another 2 or 3 weeks. They repaired the hole. You can go there, you can look at it, you won't be able to see it, but they thought better of lifting the painting up, so it still sits a little bit too low in terms of its original situation. So, the Museum of Modern Art has, over 9 decades as opposed to 9 centuries, reworked its own presentation of itself in ways that I'd like to suggest bear some similarity to the issues at the Louvre, although in a much more modest political and historical ambit. That doesn't mean that MoMA doesn't take its own self-presentation every bit as seriously as the Louvre does. What's interesting with MoMA is that, you probably all know the story, so I'll go over it quickly. It starts almost exactly where it exists today in 1932 in a townhouse which is given by the Rockefeller family, and in very short order it determines that it's going to build its own building. This is the famous 11 West building, or the original MoMA building as it's now called, of 1939. This is, needless to say, an unusual building in the context of 53rd Street and a very unusual building in New York. It self-consciously imports a number of European themes from architecture of the 1920s. It's done that way quite deliberately by 2 American architects, Philip Goodwin and Edward Durrell Stone. And you can, I'm sure you know them, but you can see quite quickly that there is a there is a curtain wall which is pushed out from the facade with a very exotic, at the time, translucent material. Above, in the office areas, there are banded windows. The entire surface is framed with white marble, all of it held off of the actual structure, which you can just make out behind. There is this issue of transparency at the ground floor. There is a deliberately asymmetrical entrance and a kind of expression of what's seen as free plan. And then on the top floor, there is an exterior terrace with a kind of reinterpretation of sort of brise soleil. So there are a number of Corbusian, Weissenhof-Siedlung motives that are being kind of quite deliberately imported without necessarily being entirely understood by these two architects, neither of whom had ever actually traveled to Europe at the time. And MoMA here sits in front on 53rd Street, and the celebrated garden in its first iteration looks like this. It's gone through almost as many redesigns as the museum itself. And just to pick up on a couple of those design features, here is this very famous recessed curve that reciprocates with the curved awning on 53rd Street. Very important that it is asymmetrical and that it kind of cheats towards Fifth Avenue, from which it was imagined most of the visitors would be arriving. The curve continues inside and into, past the desk and into the major painting gallery. There's a bit of confusion about whether it actually wants to be, can't get this to work, but free plan. You can see columns that are freestanding, columns that are fully engaged, columns that are slightly engaged. And the other major feature, which figures prominently in the story in a few moments, is what came to be called the Bauhaus Stair. This was the original stair that connected all of the public levels of MoMA, that is up to the third floor and then down to the second basement where the two theaters were located. And it's worth also pointing out that this entire movement in the lobby and through to the garden followed this kind of sinuous curve and then created a new axis that was also off-center from the six-bay composition. So here is that lobby, and there, just behind the edge of the counter, can't see it, but is the start of the Baja Stare going off into that dark place. Now, this is the Baja Stare, so called because at the top of the first landing, the famous painting by Oskar Schlemmer of 1932 had pride of place. And that was the MoMA that many of us knew still into the early 60s. It was seen as not simply a wonderful museum building, but a museum building that was declaring MoMA's adherence to all things modern in art. It was spoken about that way, both by people who went to MoMA and, more importantly, by the curatorial and administrative staff of MoMA. MoMA was seen as embodying the very kind of attitude towards art, architecture, and design that is to say MoMA's building was seen as embodying this very attitude that MoMA itself was seen as having been created to promulgate. That is the situation until the 60s, when Philip Johnson, who has a very long history with the museum, essentially bookends the original building with two new pavilions. There were many alternative designs. Ultimately, this was a Corten steel facade structure. And more significantly, he completely remakes the entry here. None of these is a particularly good photograph, I apologize, but you can see that what he's done is to create a completely symmetrical axial relationship to the garden, which is precisely the contrary of what the original building had intended. And he's taken this transparency and worked out this rigorously symmetrical arrangement where brochures are on one side, the bookstore on the other, and all of this crowned with a stainless steel awning, which again picks up this notion of bilateral symmetry, nothing to do with the museum as it had originally been designed. The other thing that's difficult to read from the photographs, but very significant, is that this translucent two-story, the second and third floors, had originally been made with an experimental material that was imported from Switzerland and which failed in the first 3 or 4 cold winters in New York. Failed in the sense that the panels began to delaminate and water got in behind them, and MoMA's solution was simply to put an opaque wall 2 feet in front of this translucent area. Johnson decides not to tackle that problem, and so you have this anomaly of the great transparency of the the gallery volume, the upper gallery volume of MoMA, being essentially blocked off from public view by the fact that technically it had failed and it was necessary to build walls there. Somewhat later, in the early 80s, Johnson and Caesar Pelli, who's responsible for the museum tower, also alter the entry sequence by, of course, adding on a new set of escalators in the garden. And, oh, goodness. Well, that isn't going to be very easy to read. I don't know why it's doing that, but I hope that isn't true for all the plans. You'll need to take my word for it that this is the original building from 1939. This is the Pelli edition of 1984. Here is the garden also from 1939. And what you just can make out in red is essentially the enlargement that was proposed in 1999, for which Yoshio Taniguchi was the design architect. What it does, and you don't see the beautiful graphics that I put on this, but what it does is to take the original entry here and to shift it down to this new through block entry. And what that, of course, does is to change the frontal perpendicular relationship to the garden and the entry on 53rd Street to one that's tangential. At the same time, the garden itself is restored. Here you can just make that out. So this was the entry that Johnson had placed over the original building. This is the new entry that now exists there, and this is the changed relationship with the axis of the garden. But at the same time, that in essence, the whole reason for MoMA occupying this original site and original building is now being obviated by shifting the museum to the west, a decision is made that the original Goodwin Stone building from 1939 should be completely restored. And here, once again, completely restored means, in essence, remade from scratch. The awning no longer exists. The glazing for the curved entry no longer exists. The glazing above on these two stories, as I said, had failed. And in fact, remaking the glazing involved finding the original Swiss manufacturer, who had since gone on to manufacture other things, at great expense, asking them to remake these panels, but now to sandwich them in a thin glass composite, which would allow it to be actually integrated into a performing curtain wall, and to essentially rebuild from scratch a facade that spoke to MoMA's presentation of itself as a building and an institution as of 1939, embracing a certain image of modernism, even if the gallery space was at that very moment being converted into one of the most expensive new restaurants in all of New York. So this is Alfred Barr's original space for showing painting and sculpture as it exists today. The Bauhaus Stair was also restored, although only as a vestige, because for fire code reasons it was not possible to extend it all the way down to the basement. New York's zoning codes had changed and you couldn't connect more than 3 floors, but it was lovingly restored, and you see here the transparency once again reestablished with those Swiss panels I mentioned a moment ago. So this is the situation as of the end of 2004. So here is what's left of Johnson's 2 buildings. This is the freshly restored 1939 building. Here is Caesar Pelli's Museum Tower, and all of this is Taniguchi's expansion, which goes all the way through to the other side. This little building, as I'm sure you know, the last one in the row, is Todd Williams and Billy Shinn's American Folk Art Museum, which no longer exists because it went out of business and MoMA purchased that site. But already in 2004, MoMA had plans to continue expansion, first on the vacant site that they already owned, and second on the site of the Folk Art Museum, which they were able to acquire. The first site was sold to a developer on the condition that whatever was built on it should give back to MoMA the base 4 floors for expansion of MoMA's galleries. However, MoMA did not ask that there be any coherence between its 2004 project and the new building. And the result, by a very gifted and well-known architect, Jean Nouvel, is a kind of, what should we call it, structuralist neo-brutalism that now finds its place in the succession of MoMA-related facades, all the time expressing the fact that this is space that in fact belongs to the museum. You can see that in this particular image, the Museum of Folk Art still exists there. But as I said, in 2011, that building had been acquired and the decision was made to demolish it, a very controversial decision. And the project to remake the space and in some sense connect the two sides of MoMA was given to the firm Diller, Scofidio and Renfro. And this project is still in the developmental stages, but what's interesting about the first of these renderings that were offered to the public is that the theme of transparency, which you can see in the Taniguchi galleries, which are now apparently to be reglazed in order to allow light from inside, the theme of a new entrance even further west than the Taniguchi entrance, and above all, I think what one can fairly call an embracing of the notion of spectacle and transparency, and an image of activity on the street has become the kind of watchword for the aesthetic of this new extension. But it's interesting that even in that context, even as Diller, Scofidio shift the entire circulation scheme of MoMA and reinterpret it, they are nevertheless proposing that the Bauhaus Stair be once again remade in its 1939 vintage format and extended all the way down to the basement, although to do that, they're essentially going to have to cut it off from all of the other galleries around it and have it be in its own fireproof container. So I hope I've given you an impression of how these two very different projects in some ways use overlapping or parallel kinds of ambiguities in their ways of questioning the line between conservation and curation. Perhaps, Peter, there's nothing sufficiently extreme in this. And so what I thought I'd do is to close with just a few images of a place where I think exactly the same issues are being played out, but in a much more extreme way. And these are at opposite ends of the Museumsinsel in Berlin, where, as some of you know, David Chipperfield's office has just completed a really quite remarkable, painstaking, uncovering, restoration, and very, very careful reconstituting of the history of the Neues Museum, with really admirable attention to being absolutely certain what every uncovered layer means, quote unquote, in terms of its relationship to a history that includes extensive bombing during World War II and the period of Nazi political power and all the different uses to which this building had been put in the 140 years of its existence. And this has been carried into the actual display rooms where objects float in what can only be called a kind of palimpsest or perhaps a collage of these different periods brought together because that's what the remaining artifact or environment had left, or what history had left us of it. So contrast that with the project that's just being built a kilometer away. This is the reconstruction of the Stadtschloss, originally a 15th through 18th century Baroque construction, very heavily damaged in the bombing of World War II, not completely demolished. There were arguments even in the 50s about whether it shouldn't be restored. This was, of course, part of East Germany, the GDR, and it was the GDR that made the decision to demolish the ruins of this building over the protests of West Germany and to build its own new Salle de République, the Palais de République, which was the governing arm of the GDR's parliament. That building itself was demolished after unification, and what is now going up is, I think, what we can only call a pastiche. It's called the institution, the Humboldt Forum, It's to include a museum of African and other non-Western art, a cinema, an auditorium, a great deal of shopping, and the compromise that was worked out in order, this is being built to the tune of 600 million euros, but mostly with private funding, and the compromise that was worked out in order to get the city of Berlin to give it planning approvals was that it would be a faithful duplication of the long demolished Baroque palace on 3 sides, but that it had to incorporate on the 4th side a contemporary facade. This is now in the process of construction, although apparently it has greatly exceeded the fundraising capacity of the people who want to build it, so it's not exactly clear what we're actually going to end up with. But I'm going to close with that image, and I hope if the Louvre and MoMA weren't extreme enough, at least this final example suggests the extremity of this confusion between or tension between curation and conservation. Thank you.